The sun was beating mercilessly over the dry plains, the sky a pale sheet of blue with no clouds to offer shelter, and the wind carried with it only the bitterness of dust and grit. Swirling around the abandoned road that cut through miles of wilderness, when she staggered forward, her legs weak, her body trembling with exhaustion and hunger, her face pale beneath the layer of dirt clinging to her skin. And before she could take another step, she collapsed into the dust with a soft cry that vanished into the silence of the desert, her fragile body giving way beneath the weight of despair. For she had nowhere to go, no home, no family, and no soul to offer her comfort. She lay there unconscious, the world spinning around her, until the sound of hooves broke the silence, slow and steady, belonging to a tall figure, riding a dark horse with reins gripped firmly in his weathered hands. A cowboy whose eyes had seen both the cruelty of men and the kindness that still lingered in a heart like his. And when he saw her body sprawled in the dust, motionless and helpless, he pulled hard on the reins, dismounted with a swift motion, and knelt beside her, brushing the dust from her cheek as he studied her pale lips and shallow breathing, realizing she was alive but fading, a candle flickering in the wind. And without hesitation, he lifted her into his strong arms, her frail weight nothing against the strength of his chest. And he whispered softly, "Don't you worry, darling. I've got you now," before mounting back onto his horse with her pressed gently against him, the reins tight in his hand as he rode fast toward the horizon, the dust kicking up behind him like a storm, driven by a determination born not of duty, but of something deeper, something that stirred in him when he saw her face and the innocence of her suffering. The cowboy's cabin stood on a lonely stretch of land near the edge of a river, a modest wooden home built with his own two hands, weather-beaten yet sturdy, surrounded by a small corral where his horse grazed when not on the trail. And as he rode up, he dismounted carefully, carrying her limp body inside, laying her on a bed covered with a hand-stitched quilt his mother once made, the last piece of family he had left. And for a moment he stood over her, studying the rise and fall of her chest, the silent question burning in his mind. Who was she? What had driven her to collapse in the dust? And why did fate place her in his path? But questions would wait. Survival came first. He fetched water from a clay jug, dampened a cloth, and pressed it gently against her lips until she stirred slightly, her lashes fluttering open, her eyes dazed and filled with fear as though she had woken in another world. But when she met his gaze, she saw no malice, only the quiet strength of a man who had seen too much yet still, carried gentleness in his hands, and she whispered hoarsely, "Where am I?" He pulled a chair close, his voice steady as he replied, "Safe. You fainted out there on the trail. You're in my home now, and I aim to see you well again." She tried to speak, but her words faltered, so he urged her to rest, feeding her small sips of water until color returned slowly to her cheeks. And as the hours passed, she slipped into sleep once more, her body giving in to the healing hand of rest. That night, as the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the cowboy sat by her bedside, watching the shadows dance across her face, and he thought of the loneliness that had clung to him all these years since he buried his parents and lived only with the company of his horse and the silence of the plains. And now here lay a stranger, fragile as a bird with broken wings, yet her presence filled the cabin with a warmth he had long forgotten, stirring a yearning deep in his chest, a reminder that even a hardened man could crave companionship. Days passed, and each morning he brought her food. Fresh bread he baked himself, eggs from his hens, and sometimes venison from his hunts. And though she ate little at first, her strength began to return. And with strength came words, slowly spilling the story she had carried like a burden across the desert. She had been cast out, betrayed by those who should have loved her, a stepfather cruel with drink and anger, a town that turned a blind eye to her suffering. And when she could no longer endure the bruises and the threats, she fled into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, hoping for freedom, but finding only hunger and exhaustion until her body gave out. As she spoke, tears welled in her eyes. But the cowboy never interrupted, never judged, only listened with the patience of a man who knew pain himself. And when she finished, he simply said, "You're safe here. No one will lay a hand on you while I breathe." His words carried the weight of a vow, and she believed him, because in his eyes she saw truth. the kind that needed no fancy promise, only the strength of a man who lived by honor. As the days turned to weeks, she healed not just in body but in spirit, helping him with chores around the cabin, fetching water, tending to the hens, and soon laughter began to bloom in her voice, soft and unsure at first, then stronger, filling the cabin like music, and the cowboy found himself smiling more than he had in years, his heart softening with every glance she gave him. Every moment their hands brushed while working side by side. The bond between them grew, unspoken yet undeniable, and though neither dared to name it aloud, both knew that something sacred was blooming between them in that lonely place. But peace in the West was never permanent, for trouble always lurked beyond the horizon, and one evening as the sun bled red over the land, riders came. 3 men, rough and mean, their eyes full of greed when they spotted her near the corral, recognizing her from the town they had ridden from, knowing her stepfather had sent word, claiming she had run off with money he swore she stole. They circled like wolves, their voices mocking as they demanded she be handed over. But before fear could choke her breath, the cowboy stepped out from the cabin, his rifle in hand, his stance wide and unyielding, and with a calm voice that carried steel, he said, "She stays here. Any man that thinks otherwise will answer to me." The tension crackled like lightning, the men sneering, spitting in the dirt, but something in the cowboy's eyes warned them that crossing him would be the last mistake they ever made, and after a long silence filled only by the restless snort of their horses, they turned and rode off, cursing under their breath. But he knew they would return someday, for men like that did not forgive, yet he also knew they would find him ready when they did. That night, shaken yet safe, she whispered her gratitude, tears shining in her eyes, and he brushed them away with the back of his hand, his voice low and steady as he told her, "You don't need to thank me. This is your home now, same as mine." And in that moment she realized she was no longer alone, no longer wandering through the dust with nowhere to go, for fate had brought her into the arms of a cowboy whose heart was stronger than the storms of the plains, and together they would face whatever shadows dared to threaten their peace. As weeks melted into months, their lives entwined, the cabin once lonely now alive with warmth, with laughter, with the quiet joy of two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of places, and though scars remained on both their hearts, love grew like wildflowers pushing through the cracks of dry earth, beautiful and unstoppable, and the cowboy, who had once believed his life destined to be lived alone beneath endless skies, now knew he had found a reason to ride home each evening, a reason to fight and a reason to hope. And to you, dear listener, if this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of fate, of kindness, and of love rising from the dust when all seems lost, then stay with us, join our journey, and subscribe to the channel, because more stories of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable spirit of the cowboy are waiting just for you. And your support helps us share these tales with the world. The morning sun rose golden over the plains, spilling light across the cabin where peace had begun to bloom. Yet the cowboy woke with the unease of a man who knew peace in the West was fragile, like a thin sheet of glass waiting for a stone to shatter it. And as he watched her prepare breakfast by the fire, her hair catching the light, her soft smile warming the room, he felt a swell of pride and protectiveness that tightened his chest. But beneath it lingered the memory of the men who had come, the riders who had threatened to take her away. And though they had left for the time being, he knew their kind well enough to understand. They would not rest until they had what they wanted, whether it was money, power, or simply cruelty for its own sake. And he resolved that if they came back, this time he would end it once and for all. Meanwhile, she, though still carrying shadows from her past, had begun to bloom like a wildflower after rain, her laughter freer, her steps lighter. And each day she found herself leaning more into the comfort of his presence, the steady reassurance of his voice, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. And though she told herself he had taken her in only out of kindness, a part of her heart began to whisper that perhaps fate had written their paths together, for in his silence she found strength, and in her joy he found healing. One afternoon, while they tended the corral, mending a fence broken by the restless hooves of his horse, she asked him why he had chosen a life of solitude, why a man of such quiet strength would live alone out here with nothing but land and silence. And after a long pause, he told her of the past, of how his parents had died young, His father shot in a dispute over land, his mother passing soon after from heartbreak, leaving him to fend for himself since he was little more than a boy, and how the world had taught him early that trust was a dangerous thing. Yet kindness was the only way to stay human, and so he had built a home on the edge of nowhere, where no one could betray him, no one could hurt him again, until she appeared, broken in the dust. And for the first time in years he had opened his door and his heart to another soul. Her eyes filled with tears at his confession, for she too knew the ache of betrayal and loneliness. And without thinking, she reached for his hand, their fingers entwining naturally, as though they had been waiting all their lives for that single touch. But as tender as the moment was, the West had no patience for happiness without trial. And just as the warmth of evening settled over the land, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance once more, louder and harsher than before, and when he stepped onto the porch with his rifle resting against his shoulder, he counted not 3 but 6 riders approaching, their faces grim, their guns at their hips, and at their center rode her stepfather, a bitter, heavy-set man with eyes like cold steel, his voice booming with venom as he called out, "That girl belongs to me. You got no right keeping her." The cowboy's jaw tightened, his gaze steady as he replied, "She belongs to no one but herself. And if you think you'll take her from here, you'll be planting your boots in the dirt permanent." The men sneered, spitting tobacco and gripping their reins, and though fear clutched her heart as she stood, inside the cabin peering through the window, she also felt something stronger, faith in the cowboy, in the vow he had made that no one would harm her again, and she knew he would keep it even if it cost him his life. The standoff stretched long and tense, the sun dipping lower as shadows crept across the land, until finally the stepfather barked an order and 2 riders dismounted, guns drawn, moving toward the cabin with the intent to drag her out. But before their boots hit the porch, the cowboy raised his rifle, firing a warning shot that shattered the silence and sent the men stumbling back, his voice cutting through the air like thunder as he growled, "Next one won't be a warning." For a moment, even the hardened men hesitated, recognizing the steel in his stance, the way his rifle never wavered. But the stepfather's pride burned hotter than sense, and he snarled for them to attack. And in an instant, the world erupted into chaos, gunfire, cracking through the twilight, bullets striking wood and dirt, horses rearing in panic, and she, terrified but unwilling to watch him fight alone, grabbed the small pistol he had left in the cabin for emergencies, her hands shaking as she stepped onto the porch and fired into the air, her voice trembling yet fierce as she cried, "Leave us alone!" The sudden boldness in her voice startled the attackers, and though her shot did not strike any man, it sent a clear message that she would no longer cower in silence, that she would fight for her freedom alongside the man who had saved her. The battle was brief yet brutal, the cowboy's steady aim felling 2 men who refused to back down, while the others, seeing their numbers broken and their courage faltering, scrambled onto their horses and rode off into the night, dragging the wounded stepfather with them, his curses fading into the distance as the sound of hooves disappeared beyond the horizon. Silence fell heavy after the storm, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder, and as the cowboy lowered his rifle, sweat and dust clinging to his brow, she rushed to him, tears streaming down her cheeks, her hands trembling as she touched his arm, whispering, "You could have been killed." But he only shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he replied, "And leave you alone again? Not a chance." She collapsed against him then, sobbing into his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though he would never let go. The fire of battle giving, way to the quiet truth neither could deny that in each other they had found something, worth fighting for, worth living for, worth dying for if need be. In the days that followed, peace returned once more, fragile but real, and though the threat of the stepfather lingered, both knew he had been broken that night. His pride shattered, his men scattered, and while trouble might return someday, they also knew they would face it together. For no longer was she a broken girl lost in the dust, and no longer was he a lonely cowboy hardened by solitude. Together they had become something stronger, something unbreakable. Their bond deepened with each passing day, not spoken in grand declarations, but lived in the quiet moments, the way he fixed the roof while she laughed below, handing him tools with playful banter, The way she mended his torn shirts by the fire, humming softly. The way their eyes found each other in silence and spoke more than words ever could. And slowly love took root, steady and enduring, like an oak tree weathering every storm. One evening, as the stars blanketed the sky and the river whispered softly beyond the cabin, he took her hand, his voice rough with emotion as he said, "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You've given me a reason to hope again. And I reckon I don't ever want to face another sunrise without you by my side." And tears filled her eyes as she whispered back, "And you've given me a home when I thought I'd never have one again. I'll stay as long as you'll have me." With that vow, unadorned yet eternal, their hearts sealed what fate had begun. And in the quiet of the plains, beneath the endless sky, they found not just survival but love, not just shelter but a life worth living, a life they would build together no matter what storms came their way. And to you, dear listener, if this tale has carried you away into the dust and fire of the Old West, if it has reminded you of the power of kindness, of courage, and of love that rises from despair, then I invite you to stay with us, to subscribe to the channel for more stories await, each one carrying the spirit of the cowboy and the hope that even in the darkest times, light can be found when two hearts choose to fight for it together.